Recently, I got a comment to one of my videos that gave me a link from the Associates of Biblical Research, stating that yes, there is archaeological proof that the character Abraham from the story of Genesis did exist indeed. So I'm going to take a look and we'll find out if this has any legitimacy whatsoever. So did the biblical character Abraham actually exist? Well, the Associates for Biblical Research seem to think so. And thanks Marty for submitting the comment in the link, because I am a fair guy, and if someone states they have evidence to prove something in the Old or New Testament, I'm going to take a look at it. Because as I've said before, I am a theist that wants to be convinced. And Abraham is extremely important in this quest for truth. For the biblical character of Abraham was the central patriarch from where not only Christianity evolved from, but Judaism and Islam as well. Now, Scott Lancer was the host of this episode of Associates for Biblical Research, and he was interviewing Brian WINDLE, the pastor of the Island Bible Chapel located in Ontario, Canada. And I looked that church up, and they're evangelist. So I'm going to say right from the get-go that an evangelist believes in the infallibility of the Bible and is biased towards it no matter what the actual evidence presents. But let's give the guy his fair shot, because there is no historical evidence whatsoever that says Abraham and his family existed. And Pastor WINDLE would be right in the effect that the only evidence we would have to come from the story of Genesis or archaeological evidence that confirms that the events occurred. And this is troublesome right from the very beginning, because the Abraham of the Bible lived approximately 2,000 years before Christ, and most scholars think that the Hebrew book of Genesis was written 500 to 600 years before Christ. So there are no writings whatsoever at the time of Abraham's existence that confirm that he existed at all. So Pastor WINDLE has gone to archaeological evidence to prove it. And I'm going to cover about half of his archaeological proofs and save the rest for a part 2 of this series, because it's important to go through this carefully to determine whether Pastor WINDLE is offering evidence or conjecture. And I'll present his so-called evidence, but I'm going to tell you right now, this is nothing more than speculation, like usual from fundamentalist pastors. He confirms his own bias in the video, for he states, and I quote, "For those of us who believe in the historicity of Scripture, it is important to see these things that are in even stories like this, accounts like this, that are accurate." Pastor WINDLE, you just confirmed your bias, for you're stating from the get-go that in your faith, you have to see these stories as accurate. That presents bias, Pastor, and bias has no place in research. But let's see what he has to say. His first presentation of evidence is by noting that cities that are mentioned in Genesis during Abraham's time are historically legitimate. He states that the city of Ur was actually 2 cities. One was in Turkey and one was in southern Iraq. Yeah, this is true. He states that he believes that the city they're referring to in Genesis is the northern city in Turkey. Well, that's his opinion, because most scholars think it was in the southern area of Iraq in the Sumerian culture. But I won't say that debunks him. Now, the story in Genesis in chapter 24 is that Abraham sent a servant to find a wife for his son Isaac. And he notes Haran as his second proof, because Haran was where Abraham migrated to in the book of Genesis. And Pastor WINDLE confirms this by noting beehive houses in Haran from ancient times that were found during excavations. And then he quotes the book of Joshua, who did state to his people that it is true their ancestors did live in this area. Okay, this is not evidence by any long stretch of the imagination of anything. This simply states that whoever wrote the book of Genesis, many centuries after the fact when these mythological tales occurred, noted that these areas existed. Even if they described the beehive houses, that would have been the same type of houses that they lived in the time of Genesis. This is a simple fallacy of stating that one thing is shown as true, so therefore another thing must be concluded as true. There is a place called Paul Bunyan Land in Minnesota. If 1,000 years from now, archaeologists discover the remains of this amusement park and the entrance sign that said Paul Bunyan Land, it doesn't mean that Paul Bunyan actually existed. If I wrote a fictional novel that revolved around the city of Chicago, historians will be able to say for certainty 2,000 years from now that Chicago most likely existed. But it doesn't mean that my fictional character did. It's not proof or evidence, Pastor WINDLE. And then his next point was about the Tel Dan Gate, referred to as Abraham's Gate. This gate is in reference to when Abraham supposedly rescued his nephew Lot after being captured in a battle of the kings. and Pastor Windle's confirmation is that this is the exact type of gate that Abraham would have used during this fabled rescue. But he also admits this gate was constructed several hundred years after when Abraham would have lived. But he states the significance is this gate represents other gates that match what is described in Genesis. Again, not evidence at all. Whoever started this story orally was around when these gates existed. And the fact is, we don't know when these stories of Genesis actually began. We believe it was possibly during the Sumerian time, since we have an almost identical Great Flood story with the Sumerians that could have gone back as far as 1700 years BC. But the fact that somebody is noting an archway that serves as a gate does not confirm the existence of a person who supposedly passed through one of these gates. And then he presents the Battle of Siddim as evidence for Abraham's existence, for it was in this battle when Lot was captured. The Battle of Siddim was also known as the War of Nine Kings. Now, I'm sure there were many battles in the Mesopotamian area, and I'm sure that a collection of stories were formulated because of these battles. But the general consensus among scholars is that there is little to no memory of historicity in the pre-Israelite era. The scholars are in dispute whether the Battle of Siddim actually occurred. My guess is that something like that probably did happen because the story did eventually make its way into the Bible. Much like geologists pretty much confirm that there were several large floods between the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, and that this gave rise to the ancient Sumerian texts of the Great Flood myth, which were embellished by the Sumerians in the story of King Artaxerxes, who also built a boat to escape the flood, and was later again embellished by the Hebrews in the story of Noah. So was there some sort of great battle? Yeah, there probably was. Was it exactly like Genesis describes? Who knows? We have no idea. Pastor Windle, this is what evidence would be confirming the existence of Abraham. And I will correlate this to the New Testament. There are many mentions of a Jesus Christ himself within 50 to 100 years after his death. A long time ago, I wasn't sure that Jesus Christ even existed, and it's still not completely confirmed, but enough people in a close enough time period have noted his name as an historical figure that for me, it's good enough to believe that he actually existed at least. You do not have that with Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, or Lot. You have fabled stories that were hundreds and hundreds of years later. You do not have a stone cuneiform tablet that talks about Abraham's existence. And even then, it wouldn't be irrefutable evidence, but if you found enough of those tablets, I could possibly believe that Abraham was a real character. Now, I wish I could believe in Abraham because this is very important, as the genealogy of Christ himself goes back to the Abraham DNA. So if you have one, then it gives very strong case for the unbroken lineage of another. And if you could note that lineage, that would further make me push to believe that Yeshua was exactly who they describe him as. But thus far, Pastor Windle, you do not have evidence of Abraham's existence. You have archaeological landmarks that were used in stories written hundreds of years later, and you have a battle which is in question that even happened. But the reason the fundamentalists will believe all this is because it matches their worldview that the Bible is infallible. And when you believe the Bible is infallible, you take conjecture and speculation and try to pass it off as evidence, in which you have huge fallacies in your credibility of this evidence. And that's what Pastor Windle has done thus far. But we'll see what he says in a later episode as I continue to investigate the second half of his proposals of Abraham's existence. Now, if you'd like to read something that I admit is fiction, check out my novel The Second Fall, an offbeat apocalypse sure to offend the fundamentalist, on Amazon. Link is in the video description as well as the banner, and I will see you next time as we once again take the sword of reason and reality and thrust it right through the heart of ignorance.